It's Friday, the 3rd of March, and this is Politics UK. Welcome to your weekly roundup of parliamentary highlights. I'll be joined by correspondents in Edinburgh and Cardiff, and here in Westminster by our parliamentary correspondent Susan Hume. On the programme this week, the Prime Minister hails a new Brexit trade deal for Northern Ireland with the European Union.
I believe passionately, with my head and my heart, that this is the right way forward. Right for Northern Ireland, right for our United Kingdom.
The Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer tells the Prime Minister his party will back the agreement.
We will not snipe, we will not seek to play political games. And when the Prime Minister puts this deal forward for a vote, Labour will support it.
MPs hear how drugs gangs are recruiting ever younger children.
We had another child that we referred in this week who was given a Subway. And as their lunch, they couldn't afford their lunch and they were given the Subway, and then they were told they had to repay the debt, and then that's how it starts.
In Wales, there are calls for ministers to take tougher action over Wales's largest health board.
If things can't be turned around, government should look at breaking up Betsy into smaller, more manageable parts.
Plaid's answer to everything is reorganisation, new structures, more managers. That's what we need, more managers. I want more frontline people.
I think it is time that members of this House grew up.
And Parliament pays tribute to Betty Boothroyd, the first female Speaker of the House of Commons, following her death at the age of 93.
On behalf of us all, you will never be forgotten. You made history, so please, rest in peace.
Let's start here in Westminster with Susan Hume. Susan, as we saw and heard there in the headlines, the big story this week was the new post-Brexit trading deal for Northern Ireland, introduced by Rishi Sunak and the EU. The week began with a meeting just outside Windsor. What happened?
Yeah, we've been talking about this for months and months, haven't we, Joe? And finally, there does seem to be smiles and agreement between the EU boss, Ursula von der Leyen, and Rishi Sunak, or Dear Rishi, as she called him. So perhaps that gives you an idea. It all sounds a bit dull, doesn't it? You know, we have these phrases like the Windsor Framework, the Northern Ireland Protocol, all sounds very dry, but actually it's not, because what underlies it is peace in Northern Ireland, which is pretty crucial stuff. Now, Boris Johnson's deal when the UK left the EU meant that there were no checks on goods going from Northern Ireland into the Republic of Ireland, still in the EU, of course. The reason for that? Well, they didn't want any checks, any kind of a border on that sensitive area between Northern Ireland and Ireland, because that's very upsetting for the nationalist community, the people who feel more Irish. But the flip side of that was there did then have to be checks on goods coming from the rest of the UK into Northern Ireland. And that was very upsetting for the Unionists, the people who feel more part of the United Kingdom. So very difficult issues to settle. It does seem that Rishi Sunak may have pulled it off, because when he appeared in the House of Commons, there was a general welcome. And even the people who you might have been expected to raise some objections, the DUP, for example, who walked out of the Northern Ireland Assembly in protest, and the very Eurosceptic Conservatives, they were at least muted. They at least didn't raise very strong objections.
After weeks of negotiations today, we have made a decisive breakthrough. The Windsor Framework delivers free-flowing trade within the whole United Kingdom. It protects Northern Ireland's place in our union, and it safeguards sovereignty for the people of Northern Ireland. Mr. Speaker, core to the problems with the protocol was that it treated goods moving from Great Britain to Northern Ireland as if they were crossing an international customs border. This created extra costs and paperwork for businesses who had to fill out complex customs declarations. It limited choice for the people of Northern Ireland and it undermined the UK internal market, a matter of identity as well as economics. Today's agreement removes any sense of a border in the Irish Sea and ensures the free flow of trade within the UK. Let us seize the opportunity of this moment, the certainty of an agreement that fixes the problems we face, commands broad support and consensus, and offers us at last the freedom to move forward together. That is what the people of Northern Ireland deserve. That is what the Windsor Framework delivers. As a Conservative, a Brexiteer and a Unionist, I believe passionately, with my head and my heart, that this is the right way forward. Right for Northern Ireland, right for our United Kingdom, and I commend it to this House.
I have been clear for some time that if the Prime Minister were to get an agreement with the EU, and if their agreement is in the interests of this country and Northern Ireland, then Labour would support it. Yeah. And we will stick to our word. We will not snipe. We will not seek to play political games. And when the Prime Minister puts this deal forward for a vote, Labour will support it and vote for it. Yeah. This deal is not perfect, but because we recognise that the UK agreed to the protocol and has an obligation to make it work, because we recognise that for the protocol to work, there will inevitably be trade-offs, and because we always recognise that peace and prosperity in Northern Ireland is hard won, Labour will support the Windsor Framework. I hope that in coming days others will come to support the agreement in the same spirit and join Labour in voting to make the protocol work, in voting to face the future, in voting for country before party.
What this deal does not do is create parity for the nations of these isles, because what it allows, and I see the Northern Ireland Minister sitting there who was very positive about this in an interview earlier on, it means that businesses in Northern Ireland have access to the single market, whereas businesses in Scotland do not. Now, I do not begrudge that to the people and businesses of Northern Ireland, but I do regret that Scotland does not have those same opportunities.
In broad terms, it is clear that significant progress has been secured across a number of areas, whilst also recognising that there remain key issues of concern. There can be no disguising the fact, for example, that in some sectors of our economy in Northern Ireland, EU law remains applicable in our part of the United Kingdom. My party will want to study the detail of what has been published today, as well as examining the legal text, the political declaration and the government's command paper. Where necessary, we stand ready to engage with the government in order to seek further clarification, reworking or change as required.
We are happy today that things seem to have moved. I would say, though, Mr. Speaker, there's been an awful lot of talk, particularly today and over the recent months, about the concerns of the DUP and the Unionist community. It is important to remember that the majority of people in Northern Ireland oppose Brexit and do want to see the benefits of dual market access properly utilised.
For us, the key test is the preservation of Northern Ireland's dual market access. And in that regard, my party has massive concerns around this potential dormant break. So does the Prime Minister understand that there are real dangers that this process could add more instability into the Assembly?
He makes a good point. There are many people, communities, businesses in Northern Ireland that value their access to the European Union single market. They value, rightly, not having a hard border on the island of Ireland, and we have strived to protect that in this agreement whilst ensuring Northern Ireland's place in our union and protecting and safeguarding its sovereignty. I believe that the Windsor Framework does get that balance right, and I look forward to having that conversation with him.
Flavour of opinion there in the House of Commons to the deal. And on Tuesday, the House of Lords had their chance to say what they thought about the deal. Yeah, we heard Keir Starmer there saying no political games.
in the House of Lords, the Labour leader there, Lady Smith, did allow herself just a little political jibe at Boris Johnson, saying, don't forget that this is actually Boris Johnson's deal that you're there having to repair. Boris Johnson's solution had been something called the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill, and that was if the EU wouldn't negotiate anymore, then we would just scrap those checks unilaterally, pay no attention to them. Some said that that was the big stick that was needed to get the EU to come to an agreement. However, the government has said that it's going to scrap that. They're not going to go ahead with that. It is in front of the House of Lords at the moment, but it's not going any further, and Labour did welcome that.
We welcome the Prime Minister's statement and the publication of the Windsor Framework announced by Mr Sunak and President von der Leyen. It proves that the complex legal and trade issues are best resolved through diplomacy, not unilateral action or headline-seeking bluster. We welcome the Prime Minister's change of approach. And we welcome that Mr Sunak now has, as part of the agreement, finally committed not to proceed with the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill. The Prime Minister's statement is admission that the government made mistakes in the negotiating and signing of the protocol, and that there was a lack of honesty. But, my Lords, we welcome the statement today, and as we move forward, this should be an opportunity to also reset our politics.
For months, the wrangling over the protocol has taken up a huge amount of time and political capital. It preoccupied your Lordship's House with the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill, and it acted as a blockage to constructive engagement between the UK and the EU on a range of other issues which had absolutely nothing to do with the protocol itself. It would perhaps be churlish to point out, however, that the only reason all this effort was needed, and that all the contortions required to get to today's position were necessary, was because of the deeply flawed original agreement. An agreement enthusiastically supported at the time by those who have now fundamentally renegotiated it.
I would observe that the House obviously always indulges itself in criticising the Right Honourable former Prime Minister. I have to leave on the record that but for him, we would never have left the EU as the public requested in a referendum. And we should also remember that the Northern Ireland Protocol, with all its imperfections, was born of a situation where this House and the other House, a majority in both those houses, was seeking to frustrate that.
Now, overnight we have had some more greater analysis. Some of the unhelpful exaggeration around the deal has been stripped away. So for accuracy, can the leader, for whom I have great personal respect indeed, confirm to what extent Northern Ireland will continue to be governed by EU laws and subject to EU legal jurisdiction for large parts of our economy, for which no consent has ever been sought or given?
So far as the range of EU law is concerned, I'll have to write to him on a specific number of instruments. But as the Prime Minister set out very clearly, about 1,700 pages will be removed of EU law. Yes, and the statement was absolutely honest about this, there will be about 3% of EU provisions, EU law provisions will remain in relation to goods and the matters covered by the protocol. What will apply to so much in this framework now is not EU law, but international law governed by the Vienna Convention.
Thanks for that, Susan. For now, we'll be back to you later on. Let's go to Holyrood now and speak to our Scotland political correspondent, Andrew Kerr. Hello to you, Andrew. Tell us about Scotland's proposed recycling scheme for drinks, bottles and cans, because it's proving to be controversial. Why?
Yes, that's right, Joe. This policy staggers on. It's being attacked seemingly from all sides at the moment. So from August, people in Scotland will have to pay 20 pence extra for every drinks bottle and can that they purchase, and of course they get that money back once the item is recycled. But the drinks industry is up in arms at the moment, saying this will cost them an arm and a leg, something we've covered in the programme before. Now, there's a row over how many producers have signed up to this government scheme. The government say 90% of volume will actually be covered. And all that said, there's still another significant problem with the UK government concerned about the setting up of internal UK trade barriers, because this will be purely a Scottish scheme. So they've not agreed an opt-out from the UK Internal Markets Act, and that came up in the Chamber earlier in the week.
His claims are simply not true. His story is shifting and changing with every telling. First, we hadn't asked. Then we hadn't formally asked. And then it wasn't a ministerial request. It's all nonsense. Presiding officer, this scheme will go live in August, and I can say that with confidence because people have voted with their feet. Producers have registered, and I am both grateful to them for doing so and proud that Scottish businesses are rising to the challenge. They saw their legitimate concerns addressed by the Scottish Government, and they decided whether to take part in the scheme.
So now the Scottish Government is trying to pick fight with the UK Government, who have confirmed to me in the past hour no official request for an internal market exemption has been received. This is a desperate attempt to shift blame for a home-made shambles. Small producers are appalled by the scheme rollout and have not registered, which is why the Scottish Government has been forced to consider introducing a grace period. It's too late now to make such fundamental changes to the scheme without creating even more complexity, confusion and cost. Simple question. Does the Minister accept that more than 80% of producers have not signed up to the scheme?
Minister. As of today, producers responsible for more than 2 billion drinks containers have signed up with Circularity Scotland. And this represents the full range of drinks producers, from global brands to small craft breweries and distilleries. This means that more than 90% of the annual total volume of products are included in the scheme. 90% of what we see on our shelves. This means that the scheme has momentum toward that August 16th launch.
So, who is right and who is wrong? Well, the Scottish Government say they have been asking for months for that opt-out. The UK Government say there has been no formal request for the opt-out, and I think formal is the operative word here, Joe. I think that is what is making this argument for the UK Government.
Well, as you say, it's proving to be controversial still, and it's an issue that came up at First Minister's questions, tied up very firmly with the race to replace Nicola Sturgeon.
Yes, that's right. All the candidates wanting to replace the First Minister have concerns about this. Humza Yousaf, who's regarded here by many as the continuity candidate following on from Nicola Sturgeon, wants to pause the scheme for a year for smaller producers, whereas Kate Forbes and Ash Regan, who are also in the running, it looks like they want to bin it entirely. So the Scottish Conservative leader Douglas Ross brought it up at First Minister's questions, but we had yet another protester disrupting that there. So he had to apologise for using industrial language during his questions. He was rather frustrated at the turn of events because he had claimed he was on a roll as he attacked one of the SNP leadership candidates.
Kate Forbes is the SNP's Economy Secretary. The SNP's record is Kate Forbes' record. When the SNP government were slow in paying out COVID grants to businesses, Kate Forbes was running the schemes. When companies demanded the SNP government reset their anti-business agenda, Kate Forbes was the minister who wasn't listening. And when the ferry scandal ran even further aground, Kate Forbes was fully on board. The new Kate Forbes seems to be saying the old Kate Forbes isn't up to the job. So can I ask the First Minister, which one does she agree with? The Kate Forbes with a terrible record in government, or the Kate Forbes who says this government has a terrible record?
First Minister. Firstly, Presiding Officer, Douglas Ross said that he was on a roll. I'm not sure whether he meant rolling down the hill, but that seems to be what that question. I said last week.
Thank you. We will... Excuse me, First Minister. Thank you. We will hear the First Minister.
I said last week, Presiding Officer, that Douglas Ross was seeming awful scared of Humza Yousaf. It seems this week that he's also very scared of Kate Forbes, which says to me that whoever is standing here in my place in a few weeks' time will keep the Conservatives firmly where they belong in opposition in Scottish politics.
So fairly lively in the chamber there, but of course with that SNP leadership race, much of Scottish politics is really taking place out with the chamber at the moment, taking place in hustings and TV leadership debates at the moment.
Yes, I can just imagine. Related to environmental concerns in Parliament this week, a warning for Scotland's farmers about climate change.
That's right, Joe. No recycling this time, away from the hot air of the chamber. Worries about methane gas from Scotland's livestock. The Rural Affairs Committee were taking evidence from the Climate Change Committee. That's an independent body which advises governments. Now, they say that for Scotland to meet the ambitious climate change targets, the number of cows in Scotland need to be reduced.
I think what I'm getting from what you're saying is, but I just need clarification, is that we actually need to be really looking at diversification there.
We need to see a reduction, but not the elimination of those kind of livestock farming production processes and numbers. But I think this is such an important thing to say that we're not seeking to shrink the sector. In fact, if anything, we're seeking to grow it. It's about diversifying on the farm what is produced, and I think alongside that some of the essential services that we need, not just for climate change but also generally for the improvement of the environment, improvement of nature. Farmers should be rewarded for those things. So we're looking at a diversification generally of the profession of farming, and with that, our modelling shows very clearly that we do need to see lower livestock numbers. I know that's an uncomfortable factor of our modelling, but it's one that we have to be truthful about.
So, Joe, just finally, Chris Stark there saying it was perhaps uncomfortable to hear this, but MSPs responded by saying, well, what else could Scottish farmers actually switch to? Joe.
Thank you, Andrew. Andrew Kerr, they're reporting at the Scottish Parliament for us. Let's return to events here in Westminster, catch up with Susan. Prime Minister's questions this week, where Keir Starmer was keen to press the Prime Minister on a whole variety of topics. What came up?
Yeah, well, what didn't come up was that Northern Ireland deal, because, of course, they agree on that. So it wasn't very fertile ground for Keir Starmer to ask the Prime Minister about. So what he concentrated on was the cost of living again, with energy bills still going up, high housing costs, high food costs, that kind of thing. Keir Starmer, while he concentrated on that, he had a reference, and, this is for younger viewers, I should explain, a reference to an old comedy drama from the 80s, Auf Wiedersehen, Pet, which I wondered if that was a bit lost on the Prime Minister, because he was only 3 when that was first broadcast.
After 13 years of Tory failure, the average family in Britain will be poorer than the average family in Poland by 2030. Exactly. That's a shocking state of affairs. If the Tories limp on in government, we're going to see a generation of young people learning to say Auf Wiedersehen, Pet in Polish, aren't we?
It's clear to everyone that the biggest impact on households' living standards is the energy prices that we're suffering at the moment as a result of an illegal war in Ukraine. And I just remind the honourable gentleman what we are doing to ease people through that. Because of our energy price guarantee, right now the government is paying over half of a typical household energy bill, saving households right now £1,000. It is one of the most generous support schemes globally. Now, he knows future decisions to support cost of living are for the budget, but if he's concerned about the cost of living, what he should do is stop making inflationary, unfunded spending commitments and back our plan to halve inflation.
Energy bills are going to go up by £900 in April. He knows he's going to have to act, but who's going to pay? Hard-working families through higher taxes and more borrowing, or the oil and gas giants celebrating record profits?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I know the honourable gentleman. He made a rare trip out of North London to visit Davos. Recently. Perhaps while he was there, he missed the survey of 4,000 global CEOs from 100 different countries that ranked the United Kingdom as their #1 European investment destination. Now, if he's serious about getting the economy growing, then he should stand up to the vested interests in the unions and back our minimum service levels.
If he was serious about investing in the future of the country, he'd start with housing. A few months ago, his backbenchers forced him to scrap house-building targets. At the time, he stood there and said it would mean they would build more homes. Well, would you believe it? A few months later, the Home Builders Federation say house building is going to fall to its lowest level in 75 years. Now, he can change course on this. He can bring back targets and planning reforms, or he can duck that fight and let a generation down. Which is it?
Prime Minister. Actually, Mr. Speaker, we've had recordly high numbers of house building and indeed the highest number of first-time buyers in around 20 years under this government.
For his final question, though, Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, raised the issue of leaking of 100,000 or so WhatsApp messages sent and received by the former Health Secretary Matt Hancock during the pandemic. What was it all about?
Yeah, well, these WhatsApp messages Matt Hancock had actually given to the journalist Isabel Oakeshott to help him write his memoir of the pandemic. However, she has since given them all to the Daily Telegraph, who are publishing these stories as a result. Matt Hancock says not only is this a huge breach of trust, but also it's giving a quite wrong impression of what went on because they're edited and it's a partial account. Now, Keir Starmer didn't get into the weeds of testing or care homes or schools or any of that kind of thing, but he was concerned that all of this should really be looked at by the COVID inquiry, which has got underway, and he wants to see that report as soon as possible.
Mr. Speaker, I don't want to finish this session without asking about the COVID disclosures in today's Daily Telegraph. Now, we don't know the truth of what happened yet. There are too many messages and too many unknowns. Oh, but families across the country will look at this, and the sight of politicians writing books, portraying themselves as heroes or selectively leaking messages will be insulting and ghoulish spectacle for them. At the heart of this is every family who made enormous sacrifices for the good of the country, or who tragically lost loved ones. The country deserves better. The COVID inquiry has already cost the taxpayer £85 million and hasn't heard from a single government minister yet. So can the Prime Minister assure the House no more delays, that the inquiry will have whatever support it needs to report by the end of this year?
Minister. Well, Mr. Speaker, the last couple of years were an incredibly difficult time for everyone involved in the health service, and I pay tribute to all their hard work, and I know the House will join me in that regard. And now, rather than comment on piecemeal bits of information, I'm sure the honourable gentleman will agree with me the right way for these things to be looked at is the COVID inquiry. That's why we've established the COVID inquiry. And he will know, as he has mentioned it one or two times before, that he was a lawyer in a previous life, that there is a proper process to these things. It is an independent inquiry. It has the resources it needs. It has the powers it needs. And what we should all do in this House is let them get on and do their job.
As you said, the inquiry is underway, but there isn't a deadline as to when they will report. Now, on Tuesday, Susan, MPs on the Education Select Committee heard how drugs gangs are recruiting and grooming children, some as young as 7 or 8. What was actually said?
Yeah, I mean, we concentrate for obvious reasons a lot on the kind of debate that we've just seen in Prime Minister's questions of politicians arguing. But often some of the most fascinating work that goes on in Parliament is in these committees where they take evidence from ordinary people or campaigners, that kind of thing, to find out what's going on in the country and what can be done about problems. And they've been looking at this, as you say, county lines problem, where drugs gangs recruit really young kids, I mean, not even teenagers, as you were saying, to push drugs in parts of the country, in villages, in towns. It's called county lines because it crosses local authority boundaries and police force boundaries in England. And there was some pretty heart-wrenching evidence that they gave about how young those children were and the really cruel way that they're recruited too.
Do you think A complete ban on mobile phones in schools would help. I know obviously they can switch the phones on before they go to school and when they come out of school. If you did ban it in school, it would at least take 25 hours, maybe 30 hours a week away where they weren't contactable.
It would be ideal. I don't think it would stop it. I think they would. The pressure that they would get from the exploiters to make sure they do have their phone on them might increase. The pressure they have on their families to make sure they still have their phone would increase. To stop it initially, I think, yeah, that'd be ideal. But I think we've got to understand that the relationship that a young person or someone who's exploited has with their groomer or the person that's exploiting them, they're looking at them as somebody who is almost looking out for their own looking out for their welfare. They're almost giving them everything they've ever dreamed of. They're making them part of a family or part of a team that they think of. So they get every need that is getting met by these exploiters and this gang, and that could be what's missing from home and from school.
If school is proving to be a barrier for the exploiters, we've worked with young people where the exploiters there at the school gate in a car ready to take them away. So whether or not they've got their phone is one thing, but we also know that exploiters can create situations to help make sure that young person gets excluded so they're away from the safety net of school.
How much is family breakdown in this year? I mean, we've got the highest rate of family breakdown in the OECD now. We've got, 44% of children now experience that. There's an awful lot of kids not living with biological mum and dad and having experienced the trauma of that breakup. How much is that a factor in children being at risk?
If you're a young person coming home and your mum and dad are arguing, or your mum's substance misuse or anything like that, you will turn to your phone. You will turn to social media. You will turn to online gaming. You will turn to anyone else who will make you part of something that your family, which is obviously an OCG, a criminalised gang, will be a family to them.
We are seeing an emerging kind of trend where children are being targeted who are from families who are professionals, so they might be out of shift work, police, nurses, and there are, again, it's like I said before, the traffickers will do anything to make sure that their business is going well. This week we've had a referral of an 8-year-old, and that 8-year-old has been enticed with magazines and sweets. We had another child that we referred in this week who was given a Subway. And as their lunch, they couldn't afford their lunch and they were given the Subway, and then they were told they had to repay the debt. And then that's how it starts, with the small numbers. And that's why I think, and certainly from Bernardo's, we think we are getting younger children who are being enticed in with things that they don't have at the moment because of the cost of living crisis.
What support should be available for young people in terms of the transition from primary to secondary school, in terms of levels of exploitation? Maybe Johnny.
I think, again, that provision outside of school would be a massive sort of, I'd hate to say the word buffer, but buffer between that sort of stopgap, especially because we are, like I said, we are seeing someone who's possibly 7 who is a drug runner now, maybe, and then they're obviously going from junior school to secondary school. I think there is a need for a buffer to sort of get them to help them understand what they're going to be expected to see at secondary school, what they experience, understanding their relationships. There's 6 weeks of summer holiday in between that, where obviously they leave school and they have a holiday and they go there. In those 6 weeks, it could be massive in that 6 weeks there. So we do need some sort of support around that young person in that time when they're transitioning.
Yeah, the grim reality there of drugs gangs recruiting young children. Thank you, Susan, for now. Let's go to Cardiff and our Wales political correspondent, Rhodri Lewis. Rhodri, hello to you. The State of Wales's biggest health board dominated events in the Senedd this week, with the Betsy Cadwallader board being put into special measures. What's the story there?
Well, Joe, Betsy Cadwallader has been in all sorts of trouble for years, with several reports criticising the way it was being run. It's the biggest health board in Wales in terms of population, serving more than 700,000 people across the north of the country. And it was put into special measures back in 2015 and then brought out of special measures just over 2 years ago, when it was adjudged that the situation had improved. However, last week we had a report from the Auditor General for Wales, and he found that relationships were, in his words, fractured, and the management board at Betsy was dysfunctional. And as a result, Welsh Government put it back into special measures. And here this week, during First Minister's questions, opposition party leaders turned on Mark Drakeford, the First Minister, over how the Welsh Government had handled the matter.
This is part of a wider pattern, isn't it, of a catastrophic mismanagement on part of this government on healthcare. And after 25 years of responsibility for delivering healthcare in Wales, isn't it true you've simply run out of ideas? You're throwing money at short-term sticking plaster solutions with ever-diminishing returns.
Can the existing model be resurrected, reinvigorated and re-energised to deliver that healthcare? Or is the thinking of the Welsh Government that a clean break is required and ultimately over the medium to long term, given the evidence that has accumulated to date, something completely different needs to emerge about providing health in North Wales?
Reliance on heroic individuals. The idea that a new chair by his or herself will solve the problems of the organisation, or a new chief executive by her or himself is the answer. I think we've learnt that that is not a sufficient response.
Mark Drakeford responding there. And Rhodri, the Health Minister came under fire for similar reasons later.
Yeah, she did. The Health Minister, Eluned Morgan, told the Chamber that what had happened this week was just the first step in a more comprehensive plan to try to turn things around for Betsi Cadwaladr. But with so many reports over so many years having failed to change very much, it was clear that opposition members' patience had seemed to run out.
We have a situation in North Wales where patients have died, where patients have come to harm as a result of the failings which have taken place. And frankly, people are owed an apology. We've got problems in our vascular services, our emergency departments, our urology services, our ophthalmology services, our mental health services, and our cancer services too. People waiting too long for treatment, and the situation under the watch of various health ministers in this government have gotten worse, not better, during periods of targeted intervention.
It's years since I said if things can't be turned around, government should look at breaking up Betsi into smaller, more manageable parts. Well, the sand on that particular timer ran out years ago. It's been clear to me and many staff and patients for some time that Betsi has to go.
Clyde's answer to everything is reorganisation, new structures, more managers. That's what we need, more managers. I want more frontline people trying to get rid. Oh, you will be getting more managers if you restructure. I can tell you that is the consequence of restructuring. So I want to focus on the front line.
And Rhodri, St David's Day was celebrated on Wednesday. We saw politicians wearing daffodils in the House of Commons during Prime Minister's questions, and a perennial question came up. What was it?
Well, Joe, it's become a bit of a tradition to call for March the 1st to be made a public holiday here in Wales. Wales is the only home nation that can't set its own bank holiday. It's interesting to note that Gwynedd Council in North East Wales has given its workers March the 1st off, but the Senedd, the Welsh Government, can't do the same for the rest of Wales, and the UK Government doesn't seem happy or willing to give the power to do so. As a result, the campaign continues.
On the first St David's Day of the National Assembly back in 1999, or rather in the year 2000, there was a debate proposing that St David's Day should become a bank holiday. Like the debate last year, this was supported by all members of the Assembly as it was then. However, in 2002, Paul Murphy rejected the bid, and Peter Hain did likewise in 2005. Now, would a future Secretary of State, Labour Secretary of State, give a different response to Mr Murphy and Mr Hain?
Well, thank you for that. I cannot predict what a future Secretary of State for Wales might do. I am pretty confident, though, there will be considerable sympathy and support for our ambition. Dydd Gwyl Dewi, Wales's National Day should be a bank holiday, as is the case in Scotland and Northern Ireland, who have bank holidays for St Andrew and St Patrick, respectively. The UK Government's refusal to grant this, saying that Wales has different histories, economic, social, cultural and legal systems, in my view, just doesn't wash.
Now, St David's is perhaps best remembered for saying that we should do the little things for one another. Many people here in the Senedd want the UK Government to do a little thing and make St David's Day a public holiday here in Wales.
Well, the campaign will no doubt continue. Thank you, Rhodri. Rhodri Lewis there at the Senedd. Let's return to events here in Westminster with Susan Hume. Some sad news this week with the announcement on Monday of the death of the former Speaker of the House of Commons, Betty Boothroyd. She was such a character, such a force. We remember her well in the House of Commons, and she was 93.
She was, and as you say, who can forget her iconic Yorkshire tones calling order, order, you know, back in the 90s when she was the first and so far the only woman Speaker of the Commons. And just to look back a bit, she was the daughter of mill workers, the only daughter, and her father was a trade unionist, so she was brought up in those Labour politics. But she didn't go straight into politics. She started off as a dancer with the Tiller Girls. I think she was very proud of her legs, actually, although she didn't do that for very long, and she went on to work for Labour MPs, including the former Cabinet Minister Barbara Castle. Got a seat herself in West Bromwich in the early 1970s. And but the sort of high point of her career was becoming the Speaker in 1992, a job I think she really relished, even although she stepped down 8 years later and said to MPs, "Be happy for me," before she went off to the House of Lords. So let's have a listen to some of the tributes to her in the Commons.
One of Betty's trademarked appeals to members who took too long to get their words out during Prime Minister's questions was, "Time's up!" Well, Madam Speaker, we are devastated that your time is up, but on behalf of us all, you will never be forgotten. You made history, so please, rest in peace.
Hers was a character that was forceful enough to transcend time, parliaments, partisanship, and generations. It was who she was and what she did. Her trailblazing legacy, not just the first woman Speaker, but the first from the opposition benches. She was of a generation who took ground for women's progress.
She always knew the point at which it was right to intervene with a witty remark, a sense of humour, a gentle put-down of a Member of Parliament, or a strong rebuke. And from Betty, the rebukes could be very strong.
A proud moment for all of us women in the House. She was the first and only woman Speaker, and she was brilliant in the chair. A proud moment for Labour, as a woman from a working-class Yorkshire background who blazed a trail for Labour in politics, and a proud moment for the House. She was an icon for Parliament. She was admired and respected not only in this country, but also abroad.
It was tough to be a woman in the House when she was first elected, one of 23 women MPs. And she was, I think, one of the generation who felt they had to outperform the men, really, to make any progress. I wouldn't describe her as a sister, but I do remember that she was responsible for the most revolutionary thing in those days. She introduced vending machines to sell tights. And those of us who are the revolutionary feminists who always catch our tights on the wood right across the palace, we're really grateful to that.
I used to come home from school and be wanting to watch Betty Boothroyd on television. And although I had very little concept at that time about politics or what her job actually was, she was this character that I was just absolutely obsessed with. And there's a picture of me on my 4th birthday where we were allowed at the nursery that I went to, you were allowed to go in fancy dress on your birthday. And I demanded that my parents allow me to dress as Betty Boothroyd to go into nursery that day. As I said, she was an idol.
Well, that's some tribute, isn't it, Susan?
Yeah, none of the Snow White dressing up.
Absolutely. At the age of 4. Well, she was an amazing character. Thank you very much to everyone who's appeared on the programme. That's all for Politics UK for this week. I'll be back with Politics Live on Monday at 12:15 on BBC Two and the iPlayer. From all of us here, bye-bye.